Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Got a great episode for you today, I hope. I call this one UFOs over airports, sightings, landings, and humanoids. I first became interested in UFOs over airports when I found out that LAX, Los Angeles International Airport, had many sightings. And I did cover that in another book, and in fact I did a YouTube episode about the sightings at LAX. But at that time I did not realize that UFOs and airports had a strong connection. But they do, and I came to realize that after the very famous Chicago O'Hare Airport sightings in 2006. And when that happened, I decided to take a deeper look into cases and see if there were others, because I had heard of some over the years. And boy, was I shocked when I found out that airports all over the world are being visited. And again, it's not just simple sightings, but a surprisingly large number of cases involving landings and humanoids. This is definitely a thing. Something very profound is happening here. So that's why I wanted to do this episode for you today. I want to take you on a little journey through time, starting with the modern age of UFOs in the late 1940s, all the way up to pretty much the present day. I have about, 40 cases of UFOs over airports that I'd like to present to you. And yeah, they're really astonishing. I think you're going to be surprised how many cases there are, how widespread this is, and how many cases involve not just sightings, but landings and humanoids. So let's just get started. The first case I'd like to cover took place at Chihuahua Airport in Mexico. And this was in early March of 1948, right after the very beginning of the modern age of UFO encounters. And in that month, Mexico was treated to a series of airport UFO encounters that were actually witnessed by thousands of people. It was the first week of March when about 20 military officers and airport employees at Chihuahua Airport observed a pale, cream-colored disc hover over the airport for about 3 minutes. They sent fighter planes to intercept the object, which promptly raced off to the northeast. But a flurry of sightings was reported over the next few days all across Mexico. And then, on March 10, 4 discs hovered directly over the central airport in Mexico City in full view of several hundred witnesses. And in fact, weather observers used theodolites to observe the object, which were described as tiny white globes. Now, a theodolite is a telescope which is attached to sort of a compass and protractor to allow observers to estimate the altitude of an object and its size and triangulate its position. So yeah, this was very carefully observed, and over the next 4 days, these objects continued to appear over the airport, sometimes hovering, sometimes darting around. And in fact, they appeared so regularly that people actually gathered at the airport to watch them. And this is how it all began. And year after year, airports all over the world were visited. And in fact, it was just 2 years later when the Logan International Airport in Boston, Massachusetts, had a very dramatic UFO display. It was at 9:55 p.m. on April 7, 1950, when 3 air traffic controllers, including a lieutenant colonel in the Air National Guard, were on duty at the tower at Logan International when they saw this mysterious light swoop down over the airport and begin performing, quote, unorthodox maneuvers. It would change in color from deep blue to a pure white and then back to a cherry red. And it wasn't a balloon or anything, because not only did it have lights, but this object moved against the prevailing winds and then at one point split up into two separate objects. Now the controllers did view these UFOs using binoculars, and they could see what they believed to be a solid mass within the glowing lights. And in fact, as one of the witnesses says, for obvious reasons, no formal report of this incident was made to any source. With so many reports rampantly developing from irresponsible or hysterical sources, one hesitates to solicit ridicule. But in view of the close similarity of what I witnessed, I feel it incumbent to submit this report in spite of this risk. So even at that time, there was a heavy-duty cover-up being put into place, which was preventing people from stepping forward and allowing their names to be used or even reporting these sightings at all. It's one reason why I think there are so many other cases that we don't even hear of. And here's a very interesting case. And this one occurred at the Tradewinds Airport in Amarillo, Texas. This was on April 12, 1950, only a few weeks later after the above report. The main witness was a serviceman whose name was B.G. Hunter, and his testimony was of extreme interest to OSI agents, Office of Special Investigations. And according to Mr. Hunter, he was on the airport grounds when a glowing object approached about 500 feet overhead and began circling the airfield. At this point, it started getting lower and lower, and he switched on the airport floodlights, at which point this object actually landed on the runway about 300 feet from the main hangar. And I'll just let Mr. Hunter describe what happened next. As he says, it appeared to be flat on the bottom, but otherwise elliptical in shape with a sharp cutoff towards the rear. It had a bubble sitting forward on top of the object, which appeared to be about the size of a football helmet. So this object was small. He said estimates about 8 feet wide and 3 feet high, and was emitting a lot of heat. And in fact, the grass beneath this object actually began to smolder. So Hunter decided to wake up another employee back in the hangar, but strangely, this man would not wake up. So Hunter ran back outside, and this object was still there, landed on the field, where it remained for the next 5 minutes or so. And as Mr. Hunter says, while watching the object, it suddenly raised, a whining sound was heard, accompanied by white flames approximately 3 feet in length, shooting from the rear. After reaching a level of 4 feet, it then took off in a southeasterly direction with a terrific roar, and with a sudden burst of speed, it was lost to sight. After taking off, I noticed the grass where the object had been sitting was still burning. So yeah, this is a good landing case with landing traces, and one of many cases involving actual landings. And here's another case which I'm guessing you haven't heard of before. And this involves not only a landing, but a humanoid. And this is one of the strangest of all UFO airport encounters. And as near as I could trace it, the account of it appeared in the La Hora, which is a prominent and popular newspaper in Quito, Ecuador, though it was also published in the United States. This incident took place on April 16, 1950, so that's just 4 days after the above case. And this was at the Laredo Airport in Texas, the Laredo Airport. So in the days prior to this, numerous reports were coming in from both the U.S. and Mexican sides of the border. Then, on April 16, a disc was seen buzzing the Laredo airfield at several thousand miles per hour. According to the witnesses, it circled the airport 6 or 7 times, slowed down, and came lower and lower until suddenly it apparently crash-landed on the runway itself. Firemen, police, airport personnel rushed to the scene, where they found this 6-foot wide crumpled disc. And as they approached, a 2-foot tall humanoid dressed in a silvery jumpsuit actually shot at them with some kind of weapon, which didn't really hurt the witnesses but stunned them. Afterwards, they approached the disc and found that this little man had lost consciousness. They took this weapon and pulled the man from the disc. And to their surprise, despite the fact this little figure was only 2 feet in height, they estimate he weighed about 300 pounds. One of the firemen placed an oxygen mask over the little man, which appeared to revive him, and he jumped up and actually struck one of the witnesses, National Guard Sergeant Joe Gina, knocking him down. And everyone jumped back and watched as this short figure gasped for breath and again fell unconscious. So they revived him again, at which point he again fought his rescuers. He ended up passing out twice more. So meanwhile, they were looking at this little disc, and it had very little equipment inside, but appeared to have jet-like openings surrounding the rim of the craft. Reportedly, this case was reported to the FBI, and the disc and pilot were scooped up and transported to Washington, D.C., and that's the last of it. So this story remains unverified, but neither has it been disproven. And given that there are so many cases like this, I definitely wonder about it. Because here is another case. This took place about 3 months later, again in 1950. And this involved humanoids. And this took place at the Guyancourt Airport in Yvelines, France. Now this was investigated by UFO researcher Jimmy Jeu. And according to Jeu, at around 11 p.m., airport worker Claude Blondeau was walking on the airfield when he heard a strange whistling sound. And looking for the source of the noise, he saw 2 circular craft landed on the tarmac about 300 feet away. Another landing case. And it goes on from there. There were these 2 craft, which he estimates were about 16 feet in diameter and 4.5 feet tall. You could see small windows or portholes lining the circumference. At this point, an oval door opened on each craft and out stepped 2 humanoids. They looked very much human. Each of them was about 5.5 feet tall with brown hair, and they were wearing either brown or blue flight suits. And they appeared to be repairing rod-like devices outside the craft. So the main witness, Claude Blondeau, says he felt some fear, but approached the witnesses and asked if they were having any problems with their craft. And the beings seemed surprised to see him and replied in his native tongue, in French, "Yes, but it will soon be all right." And after about a minute, they re-entered the craft. Both the craft lit up inside, at which point Claude Blondeau was able to see what he described as a red dentist-like chair in the center, and what appeared to be perhaps a control panel with weird knobs and stuff, and what looked like an odd steering type device. So the doors to the craft were still open at this point, and he inquired about these devices, and one of the beings replied, saying only one word, quote, "Power." So at this point, the doors closed. Both craft began to glow around the edges. They rose up, assumed a vertical position, and whooshed away at high speed. So I think that's an important note, that they turned vertical, because this is what we see in a lot of genuine UFO cases. The year of 1950 was a big one for airport encounters. The next one occurred in August, and this was at the Medford Airport in Oregon. Airport employee Dennis Bratner was talking with the airport manager, Johnny Applegate, when the traffic controller exited the tower. He approached both Bratner and Applegate and pointed upward and said, Look at those things up in the sky." So Dennis Bratner is the one who reported this case, and as he says, we looked. Sure enough, there were three things in the sky. They were like shining silver discs in the bright sun, very high, and seemed quite tiny. They went around and around in a great circle, and just about evenly spaced as to the distance between them. Their speed was relatively slow, perhaps 100, 150 miles an hour. They appeared to be almost circling lazily. Our puzzlement grew. What were they? Were we really seeing flying saucers? The only thing we agreed upon was that we were actually seeing something. So they called out to the several other people there, which included 2 airplane mechanics, 2 pilots, a group of passengers, a travel agent, and the airport meteorologist. And for the next hour, which is a long time, everyone stared upward at these 4 discs, which continued to circle overhead, right over the airport. So although these objects remained in view, after several minutes of watching them, the witnesses began to slowly disperse. They became bored with watching these, and Dennis Bratner had to work on filling up a gas tank on a plane. So he did that, and afterward he looked back up, and these objects were still there. And as he says, and I quote, "Then I went into the airport snack shop for a sandwich and a Coke. When I came out, I again looked up. The things were still there, circling, circling, forever circling. They had been there for at least 3 hours. Finally, and without warning, the objects departed. As he says, as I watched, the things suddenly broke out of their circling formation. They formed a line of 3 in tandem. They picked up speed tremendously and went off in a southeasterly direction toward Nevada. In a matter of less than a minute, they disappeared from sight." So these appear to be classic UFOs, judging from the way they move. They're certainly not balloons, and definitely targeted this airport for 3 hours, a very long time. The next airport case that I could find occurred at the McDonald Airport in Manitoba, Canada. And this is actually released from the official documents from Project Magnet, which is a Canadian government UFO study. This case took place on August 27, 1952. And as the Project Magnet report on the case reads, "A disc-shaped object with shadows on it, as if it had an irregular surface, was seen by 2 meteorological officers at 4:45 a.m. at McDonald Airport. The object made 2 turns about the field, and when struck by the light from the rotating beacon, made off towards the northeast and was out of sight within a second. There was no sound whatsoever. The object glinted like shiny aluminum when the beacon struck it." So another very interesting case involving the classic observables that we see from genuine UFOs. And again, all over the world. Here's another case which took place at the Mérignan Airport in France. This is a very interesting case. This occurred only 2 months later on October 27, 1952 at 2:03 a.m. The main witness is Customs Officer Gabriel Gachinard, and he observed a cigar-shaped object land briefly on the airfield about 100 meters away. He said it made a dull sound. He said the object was dark in color with 4 bright windows, and he ran towards this object, at which point it released a shower of bright sparks and took off with a swishing noise. And what's really interesting is it was just 2 years later, January 4, 1954, when the same or similar object returned to the same exact airport. It was at 9 p.m. at night on this occasion. A round, luminous machine coming from the south landed again on the airfield. The main witness in this case was Monsieur Chesneau. He's an airport fireman, and he watched as this object landed, and he immediately telephoned the control tower, at which point this object took off. And in confirmation of this report, later that evening, a nearby resident reported seeing a large reddish fiery orb overhead. And the next morning, the runway was inspected where the craft had landed, and allegedly there were a few pieces of metallic debris found, though there's no word on what this debris was or what became of it. But it's another amazing case of a UFO landing at an airport. It's amazing how many cases there are. It was that same year, September 4, 1954, when there was another amazing UFO incident. This occurred at the Santa Maria Airport in the Azores. This was at 9:45 p.m. An airport guard by the name of Vitorino Lorenco Montero says he saw a pecan-shaped object, metallic blue, actually land on the runway about 50 feet from him. He said it was pretty small, about 10 feet wide and 5 feet high. It had a clear, transparent nose, and he could see a doorway. This object, he said, made a sort of humming, whining noise as it landed, and at that point, out stepped a figure, a blond man about 5 feet 10 inches tall. He exited the object and approached Montero, and this figure says he spoke in a strange language, according to Montero, actually patted the guard on the shoulder, then returned back into the object. So, according to Montero, this figure appeared to put on sort of a harness-like device, pushed a button, and the object took off upward, leveled out, then climbed vertically, disappearing into the distance. And as you can see from the documents here, this case was in fact investigated by Project Blue Book intelligence officers who seemed to show great interest in Montero's testimony. I really like these cases because they're so worldwide. Here's another case which took place at the Cordoba airport in Argentina. This airport would have in the future more visitations, but this one occurred at 5:25 a.m. on November 25, 1954, when an airport weatherman and an air traffic controller observed two glowing objects hovering over the airport. And this is why I think it's a thing, because these objects remained over the airport for 2 full hours before finally moving off. Another case, which also took place in 1954, was in yet another country. This was at the Bankstown Airport in New South Wales, Australia. And in this case, 2 people were working late at the airport. It was just after dark when they observed what appeared to be a classic flying saucer. It had portholes all around it, and they could actually see shapes inside that appeared to be moving around, was hovering directly over the control tower. They could hear a low humming sound, at which point this object shot up into the air, changing colors as it did so, and moved with great velocity. So a pretty short case, but again, a very interesting case involving what appears to be humanoids. 1 year later, March of 1955, more than 100 people at Quito Airport in Ecuador observed 2 metallic discs hovering quite high up, about 8,500 feet overhead, but they stayed there for an hour. At that point, they did move away with, quote, incredible velocity. What's really interesting is it was just 2 months later when a nearly identical display took place over the Pisco airport south of Lima, Peru. Pilots, airport personnel, and civilians viewed 5 UFOs circling the airport for no less than 2 hours. So again, quite a long sighting. Here's a very brief case. This took place at the Tej Gaon Airport in Bangladesh in November of 1955, but it's an interesting case nevertheless because a group of saucers descended to 1,500 feet directly over the airport. They zoomed over the airport for about 1 minute, lighting up the whole airport area in bright light. So this does appear to be an intentional display. Many airports across the world are experiencing this. And the next one that I could find occurred at London Airport in England on February 25, 1959. And this involved police officials, air traffic controllers, and many others at the London airport who observed a, quote, bright yellow light varying in intensity some 200 feet above the ground. So that's quite low. And as often happens in these cases, it stayed for a long time. It hovered for about 20 minutes in full view of the witnesses. And in fact, this sighting was so widely viewed that the Air Minister Ward actually released an official statement saying, and I quote, "A pale yellow light was seen by officials at London Airport above one of the runways from 7:25 to 7:45 on the evening of February 25. There was no corresponding response on the airport radars or on-air defense radars. The light was not identified. There was insufficient evidence to determine what the cause of this light could have been." So after hovering in place for about 20 minutes, this object was observed to, quote, climb away at high speed and disappear from view. The next case that I found occurred at an airport in Exeter, England. And this occurred on June 19, 1961, and is a good example of a UFO that's just so brazen, so showing itself off, that officials have no choice but to admit to the truth of the incident. So this flying object was reported to have hovered for more than 1 hour above the airport, and according to officials, and I quote, "We do not know what it is. It was seen on the radar screen, and we have had it under observation for some time. We think it's pretty big. It appears to be shining brightly and is about 50,000 feet up." So this was not super low level, but it's important because we do have official confirmation of it, and it apparently was seen on radar. Now here's a really interesting case which took place at the Liberal Airport in Kansas on August 2nd, 1962. This was an event that actually left the pilots and airport personnel somewhat shaken up. Numerous UFOs were being reported in the area when around 8 p.m., brilliantly lit objects of different colors, including white, green, blue, and orange, quote, lit up the runways. This was viewed by more than a dozen of the employees at Liberal Airport, and there were at least 4 of these objects, one of which hovered directly over the airport and actually shined down a beam of light. The objects were also viewed by Captain Jack Metzger, who said that they moved faster than any plane he had ever seen. So being a pilot, he's familiar with aircraft. He's a trained observer, so a really good witness. It's a great case. And it's just one of many, many cases. Here's another. This took place actually on the same exact day, August 2nd, 1962, but across the world at the Camba Punta Airport at the tip of Argentina. And what happened was an unidentified spherical object actually dropped down and hovered, get this, a few feet above the runway, at which point it began emitting powerful blue, green, and orange flashes of light. So this event got a lot of publicity, with the newspapers saying, and I quote, "We do not believe the true explanation of these occurrences can be kept secret much longer." So we see this with some of the airport encounters. They're so obvious, so brazen, they simply can't be kept secret. And here's another case which also took place at Argentina. This was at the Ezeiza airport in Buenos Aires. And this occurred at 2 p.m. on December 22nd, 1962. And a UFO actually landed on the runway. It's really interesting that it actually landed. This was viewed by a technician by the name of Horacio Alora and a control tower employee by the name of Jose Besuti. They were in the middle of guiding in a Pan-American plane for a landing when this object, which they described as football-shaped, landed on the runway. It was also seen reportedly by the pilot of the plane, but shortly after this, the object rose vertically to about 1,500 feet, then flew off horizontally, disappearing over the horizon. There would later be more incidents at Ezeiza Airport. There was a very famous one in 1995. So what we're seeing is these airports are not only having UFOs land on them, it's happening repeatedly. Here's another very interesting case. This took place at the Canberra Airport in Australia. And this was on July 15, 1965, when air traffic controllers, aviation experts, and pilots at the Canberra Airport observed, quote, mysterious glowing objects hung suspended at about 5,000 feet for 40 minutes. So the sun was actually glinting on these strange craft. This was during the day, making them highly visible to all the onlookers. Finally, they decided to send out a plane. An Air Force plane was sent out to investigate, at which point the objects, quote, zoomed out of sight. It's amazing how long-lasting some of these sightings are. And it was just 13 days later and thousands of miles away when there was another really dramatic case at the Grano de Oro Airport. This is in Maracaibo, Venezuela. This occurred on July 28, 1965, when a group of student radio operators and their instructors at the airport observed, quote, 3 luminous disks. In addition to visually observing these disks, they actually tracked them on radar. These objects were described as, quote, elongated objects with a bulge in the center. Amazing. And what's most interesting to me are the humanoid cases. And here's a really good one, which took place at the Concepcion Airport in Hualpencio, Chile. This occurred just a few months after the above case. This was on October 6, 1965, when an Air Force sergeant was in his plane on the runway at the Concepcion Airport, and suddenly his radio mysteriously malfunctioned. So he exited his plane to investigate, and this is when he saw that a glowing saucer had landed at the end of the runway about 1,000 feet away. He said this craft was 90 feet across and almost 10 feet high, and as he watched, 3 figures wearing what looked like divers' suits exited and began to walk around the craft. So the sergeant stood motionless and just watched, and after about 3 minutes, these figures returned to the craft, which took off vertically and flew away. The next day, the area where this craft had landed was inspected, and there was a small circle visible just a few feet across on the ground. So again, another apparent case of landing traces. So perhaps these UFOs are landing at airports because this is what they're designed for. Hard to say. It does appear that sometimes they're putting on displays. I don't know. There could be a number of things going on here, as we'll see. And it was just a few months later when there was another incident, and this occurred at the Malton Airport in Toronto. This is in Ontario, Canada. This is in the winter of 1965. This is a pretty unusual case. 2 pilots had just landed and had steered their planes off the runway. They were exiting their planes and cleaning the snow off their windshields when suddenly a bright light appeared between their two craft, just about 10 feet away from the witnesses. It hovered there for just a few seconds, then, quote, drove off into the wind. That's an important point because that proves it's not a balloon or anything. And in fact, this object was described as a fiery, white, round ball about 1 foot in diameter. So perhaps a probe or something? It's very unusual, but it was silent and steady as it moved off and disappeared into the distance. Here's another case involving a humanoid. This is so unusual. This took place at the Maiquetía airport in Venezuela, and this was on August 26, 1967, at around 2 a.m. The main witness is Marine Private Esteban Cova. He had exited the airplane hangar at the airport when he says he was confronted by a 3-foot-tall figure with a large head, bulging eyes, and a body covered with wiry hair. So Cova spoke Spanish, and this being, speaking in Spanish, actually asked this Marine, Mr. Cova, "Won't you come with us? We need one more." At this point, Esteban Cova fainted, and when he awoke, the beings were gone. I don't blame him for fainting. That would be pretty alarming if a little ET walked up to you and said, "Won't you come with us? We need one more." But it's amazing how many cases there are involving humanoids. And here's yet another case at an airport. Again, all over the world. This one occurred at the airport in Waipukurau in New Zealand. This was on October 30, 1969, and an object described as circular with lights was seen hovering directly over the airport for some moments, and the security guards decided that they would shine a spotlight on it, at which point this object made a high whining sound and darted away at high speeds. So we see this in a few cases. Airport officials will shine a light on the object, at which point it darts away. Year after year this is happening. Moving along, the next case I could find occurred over West Palm Beach International Airport in Florida, and this was on September 14, 1972. This is a well-verified and pretty dramatic case. This object was tracked by 2 air traffic controllers. We know their names, C.J. Fox and A.W. Brown, both from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. And as A.W. Brown says about this object, quote, "It was like nothing I've ever seen." So meanwhile, in the control tower, FAA supervisor George Morales viewed this object with binoculars, and he described it as being, quote, cigar-like. And soon more confirming reports began to pour in. Eastern Airlines Captain B.F. Ferguson, police officers, and several other civilians all reported seeing this object. And this object was also reportedly being tracked by FAA operators at Miami International Airport, as well as radar operators at nearby Homestead Air Force Base. So at this point, Homestead scrambled 2 F-106 interceptors after the object, at which point it promptly disappeared. So this was publicized in newspapers, and following this incident, Major Smith, who was actually one of the pilots sent to intercept the UFO, admitted during a press conference that there was, quote, something definite in the sky, and that it had been independently confirmed on 2 radar stations. An official Air Force spokesman later added, "If it had proved hostile, we would have destroyed it." Well, I highly doubt that. I don't think we have the capacity to do something like that, nor do I think these things are hostile. But that's neither here nor there. It's just another interesting case of a UFO right over an airport. And here's another involving a landed UFO and humanoids. And this one occurred 1 year later on June 1st, 1973 at the Pemex airport in Mexico. So this involved 4 students and a radio operator who were amazed to see a large glowing UFO land on the airport runway. At this point, a being described as, get this, 12 feet tall, wearing metallic clothes, emerged from this object, walked around briefly on the tarmac, then returned to the object, which took off at high speed and disappeared. Amazing. These objects appear to have no fear of being seen. And that's certainly what happened in this next case, which occurred at Great Falls Airport in Montana. This was on December 11, 1975, when an oblong UFO was seen hovering a mere 10 feet over the runway at the Great Falls Airport. Interestingly, 2 days later, at 6 a.m. on December 13th, an object described as, quote, egg-shaped actually landed briefly on the runway and quickly took off and left. So it's just astonishing how many cases there are. And here is another case, which I already mentioned, the Cordoba airport in Argentina, but it was visited again. And this one caused a total shutdown of the airport. This occurred on June 14, 1980, and at the time there was a huge flurry of UFO sightings reported by many witnesses, including airport personnel and meteorologists. And in fact, these sightings received extensive newspaper coverage. These objects were appearing singly and in fleets, and were described variously as luminous, oval, spherical objects, or a spinning top, or, quote, a spindle shape, or a sphere that emitted an intense luminous ray that illuminated the surface of the river. So different objects. So at Cordoba Airport, a UFO caused operations to be stopped for several minutes as it was observed following the landing pattern of an aircraft towards the airport. Amazing. Here's another case. Hartford International Airport in Connecticut. 8:10 p.m., September 28, 1989, as dozens of motorists watched, a huge object with 6 to 8 very bright amber lights moved silently above the highway. The same or similar object was seen by several airport workers who described it as, quote, a large boomerang-shaped craft that descended and hovered directly above an unused tarmac area of the airfield. And as these witnesses watched, a blue beam of light shone down from the bottom of this object toward the ground, and 5 humanoid figures then apparently glided down within this beam of light. One of the witnesses gathered up his courage and actually chased one of these creatures, but it quickly went back up into the blue beam of light into the craft, which took off. It was just 1.5 months later when an airport in Kecskemét, Hungary, was visited. It was on November 13, 1989, when this incident took place, but a few days before that, Hungarian Air Force jets were reportedly followed by a strange spherical orange object. But then on November 13, 1989, 2 soldiers were on duty at the airport when they saw a 4-foot-tall glowing green figure walking around a plane. It lifted one of its arms, at which point a cone-shaped beam of light appeared overhead, and it disappeared into this beam of light and was gone. So many cases. Here's another one. This occurred at Indianapolis Airport in Indiana. This was around 7:30 p.m. July 5, 1992, when two witnesses, two brothers, were on the second-story balcony of their apartment building located about 3 miles southwest of the Indianapolis airport, and they said they saw a circle of white light with a flashing red light underneath it move towards the airport from the east. This object stopped and then appeared to hover near or above the airport for about 10 minutes. They watched as another aircraft, a plane, approached the airport, at which point this object moved upwards and dimmed its lights. And when this plane passed, the object moved back down, hovered for another 3 minutes, and then this object moved back towards the east. They estimate that this sighting lasted about 15 minutes in total. Here's another case, occurred 3 years later, December 1995. You can see there are many recent cases. And this one involves a UFO covered with colored lights that flew alongside an Aerolíneas Argentinas commercial jetliner. Actually, coming so close, it caused the pilot to make evasive maneuvers, at which point this object approached the local airport, causing all the electrical power at the airport to black out. So these are electromagnetic disturbances, which we hear about a lot in UFO cases. And reportedly, this incident made the front page of several Argentine newspapers and was also picked up internationally in newspapers in London and Paris. Strangely, in the United States, the story was barely mentioned. The editors at Art Bell's publication, UFO News, write, and I quote, "No U.S. electronic media, including CNN, presented even a blurb on newscasts. The Los Angeles Times gave it a single sparse paragraph, typical of U.S. media policy. UFO News World Report staff cannot help but wonder, what if this had occurred at, say, LAX? That makes me laugh because I know of about a dozen cases which did occur at LAX, and they still got no publicity. So most of these cases are going unreported completely, I suspect. Here's another pretty recent case. This occurred at the Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was on February 17, 2000. A man and his family were waiting for the arrival of his parents at the airport, and this is when a UFO showed up. Luckily, the witness did have a video camera ready. He was going to film his parents as they arrived. But before the plane arrived, he and his family saw a UFO hovering over the airport. And in fact, in his article, quote, "Strange Lights at Georgia Airport," the Georgia MUFON state director wrote, "This particular light was pulsating and began to change position by moving and darting up and down in a dramatically noticeable fashion. The witness then began to videotape the bright light as it loitered in the same general airspace, recording its unusual movements." So this is how we know it's a UFO, because it's moving in ways no plane can, or a balloon, or anything for that matter. At any rate, the witnesses observed this object for about 20 minutes, at which time it appeared to change shape. The object then zipped away rapidly, vertically, leaving only a streak of light. And according to MUFON field investigator Michael Hitt, who interviewed the witnesses and viewed the videotape, he said that this object appeared to have a red light in the center, and he believes it shows a genuine UFO, this videotape. And apparently this is not the only case involving strange objects over this airport, because MUFON investigators contacted officials at Hartsfield Airport. They denied any knowledge of anything unusual. But Tom Sheets of Georgia MUFON wrote, and I quote, "MUFON Georgia has investigated several solid cases involving unknowns in relative close proximity to Hartsfield Airport, and of course, the various FAA personnel knew nothing. Amazing. I just have a few more cases I'd like to cover. Here's one which occurred at the Gandhi International Airport in New Delhi, India. Again, all over the world. This occurred at 11:55 p.m. on April 8, 2000, when a yellowish-orange cigar-shaped UFO approached the airport. It flew at high altitude, halted over a cargo terminal, hovered, descended, wobbled around, and then vanished. Amazing. It does appear that they want to be seen. Now here is probably the ultimate UFO airport case. If you know anything about UFOs, I'm sure you've heard of this incident, which occurred at Chicago O'Hare International Airport in Illinois. This occurred on November 7th, 2006. And this is no small airport. And in fact, Chicago O'Hare International Airport is the world's 6th busiest airport, transporting millions of passengers each year. This was a daylight sighting. It occurred in the late afternoon of November 7, 2006, when an object described as gray, egg-shaped or saucer-shaped was observed hovering directly over Gate C-17 at Chicago O'Hare Airport. And among the first of the witnesses was a ramp employee who was communicating with UA Flight 446 at the time the object appeared, United Airlines. And this employee pointed it out to the United Airlines 446 crew. And it was around this time that many others noticed the object. Now, this case was almost effectively covered up, and if not for a reporter by the name of John Hilkovich, who actually interviewed the witnesses, it probably would have been covered up and none of us would know about it. But John Hilkovich of the Chicago Tribune did interview the witnesses, and as he writes, and I quote, "The disc was visible for approximately 5 minutes and was seen by close to a dozen United Airlines employees, ranging from pilots to supervisors who heard chatter on the radio and raced out to view it." So this object was apparently photographed as well, though these photographs have never been fully vetted. At any rate, a lot of witnesses. United Airlines Flight 0878 was in the area. Again, this is around 4 p.m. Their plane was descending to land, and the crew was attempting to obtain a visual observation of the airport. As they were passing through the clouds, there was a low cloud ceiling at this point. And as a report on the case reads, when they cleared the cloud level, the pilot immediately saw the airport and gradually noticed a gray, round object. There was a definite moment when they were above it, a moment when they were level, and a moment when they were below it. It was elliptical in shape, dull gray, with no visible markings. There were no openings for windows or doors, and as they landed, he lost sight of it, but saw it again as the plane was turning on the tarmac. So this object was very low. The overcast was about 1,900 feet, so we know it was lower than that, and it remained visible for quite a long time, at least several minutes, and was observed by not only pilots, airplane passengers, but people on the ground, baggage handlers, and several mechanics and various United Airlines ground personnel. The subject had no wings or lights. It had a metallic surface, but had sort of a soft luster that, according to one witness, shone like a pearl. A few of the witnesses reported a strange haze around the bottom of this object, like heat waves coming off of a hot road. And one witness, who was in an airport parking lot, said that the object appeared to be spinning counterclockwise. And she said that a small crowd of fellow observers were pointing up at the object and that several were taking pictures with digital cameras. Another witness just outside the airport described it as, quote, a blatant disc-shaped craft. So this object eventually disappeared straight up through the overcast by reportedly punching a hole right through the clouds. And this was a hole that remained visible long after this object had departed. And observer descriptions of this object and its departure are remarkably consistent. While there has been no confirmation of radar returns, new witnesses and photos continue to surface. And as one anonymous witness says, back on November 7, 2006, I was near Chicago O'Hare International Airport when I was witness to what was arguably one of the most important UFO incidents in modern times. I witnessed a gigantic UFO hovering over the airport at precisely 4:32 p.m. The UFO was a dark, hazy, metallic disc/cigar-shaped craft. It was at a height of roughly 750 feet above the ground, completely silent, frozen still, and was well over 100 meters in length. I managed to film the UFO on my cell phone for 1 minute. I observed the UFO for a further minute, after which time it took off and went upwards at tremendous speed and was gone. So this was a really widely viewed case. And the FAA first told John Hilkovich from the Chicago Tribune that it had no knowledge of the alleged incident. But they quickly reversed their position after the newspaper filed a Freedom of Information Act request. And now the agency claims that the November sighting was some sort of unspecified weather-related phenomena. Officials from United Airlines continued to deny the incident entirely, despite the fact that several of their own employees told reporters that they filed written reports on the sighting with their company, including drawings. United Airlines employees said that they were actually explicitly instructed by their employer not to discuss this incident. However, in defiance of the company gag order, one United mechanic told the Tribune it was definitely not an Earth aircraft. So this sighting and subsequent publicity had a huge impact on the media. It became a classic case. It even appeared on the television program Boston Legal. The storyline was about a therapist at a hospital who was fired for saying he saw a UFO over O'Hare and described the sighting in detail. So yeah, a really classic case. And here's another one which actually shut down the Shaoshan Airport in Hangzhou, China. This occurred 4 years later on July 7, 2010, and the Shaoshan Airport was apparently shut down, apparently due to this UFO. It was around 8:30 p.m. when the crew and passengers of a plane preparing to land saw a strange light hovering over the airport. This was apparently photographed. They contacted the control tower. The airport was then shut down and flights were delayed and diverted. And in fact, 18 flights were affected before this object finally flew off and went away. Now, officials have denied the presence of any UFO at the airport, though, as you can see, there are some apparent photographs of this object. And there's always another case. Here's one that occurred 3 years later on April 26, 2013. And this occurred at the control tower of Aguadilla Airport in Puerto Rico. Again, 10:22 p.m., April 26, 2013, when a Customs and Border Protection Caribbean Air and Marine Branch Maritime Patrol aircraft, a DHC-8, was on a routine patrol when it encountered a UFO immediately after takeoff. This object was spotted visually by the pilot, the captain of the aircraft, and by the control tower operator in Aguadilla Airport. This object had a strange red light on it, and the Customs and Border Protection crew thought that the aircraft might be a smuggler. So they actually began to follow the UFO and recorded it on infrared video. This video is quite famous. You can view it online. This UFO circled the Aguadilla Airport and made its way to the ocean. Initially, the UFO appeared with the shape of what looked like sort of a flying horseshoe, but then as it made its way to the ocean, it changed its configuration to what appeared to be more of a spherical shape, and this object skimmed the top of the ocean and actually submerged and appeared to be totally unaffected by the hydrodynamic forces. So I guess you could call this a USO as well. Now just a few more cases, too, I would like to cover. These cases show no signs of stopping. The next one occurred at the Mexico City International Airport, a huge airport. And this occurred on April 14, 2018. And according to Alfonso Salazar, who was working at the Mexico City International Airport, as he writes, and I quote, "A luminous UFO flying over the airport this Saturday, 14 April 2018, the time being 9 in the evening, I, Alfonso Salazar, in the company of 3 aviation technicians, witnessed a very bright flying object flying over Mexico City International Airport. The UFO was flying from west to east and beyond our atmosphere, according to calculations. It radiated an intense white light. The sighting lasted some 15 seconds before the UFO simply dimmed its lights, becoming a shadow moving across the sky." Now this was photographed. About 5 minutes later, another object passed, projecting an intermittent white light, flying from north to south at an altitude of 50 feet. This is the one that was photographed. These were UFOs, as the witness says, without question. Atmospheric conditions were very good. So another amazing case. And here's one final case I'd like to leave you with, another very recent case, which occurred at the Jorge Chavez International Airport in Peru on February 27, 2019. This was viewed by numerous staff and employees at the airport and photographed. It involves 2 unknown objects which hovered over the airport for more than an hour. This was also observed by personnel from the control tower, and in fact flights had to be delayed due to the presence of the UFOs. They did also appear briefly on the radar scopes. This objects hovered over runway 33, where they were observed by ground crew from 2 separate planes. And according to officials from Corpac, the Peruvian Corporation of Airports and Commercial Aviation, they made an official statement regarding the event and released the photographs which apparently clearly show this UFO. So again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's clear there's a strong connection here. And in fact, as researcher Lauren Gross writes, the evidence certainly seems to suggest that UFOs are fascinated with what would be their mechanical peers, since the strange objects stalked airliners, dogfought military warplanes, and loitered near airports. Not only loitered, but landed, and as we have seen, many cases involving humanoids. Those are all the cases that I could find. I expect there are quite a bit more than the ones I've presented here. And as you can see, this is a worldwide phenomena. I did cover these cases in my book, Not From Here, Volume 4. And I do think they have some really profound insights into the UFO phenomena. The fact that they're so interested in airports, I think, shows that we are dealing with people, beings, who are very much like us. And I've got a couple of theories as to why they are so interested in airports. One is that they are just simply checking up on our technology. Of course, this is pure speculation, but we do know that UFOs do show an interest in nuclear power stations and, of course, dams, as I did in another episode, military bases, anything technological. So perhaps that's what's going on here, but I think there might be layers to this. For example, this could be another case of UFOs putting on displays. We see this a lot of times. UFOs seem to brazenly show themselves wanting to be seen. And what better place than airports, which have millions of people around them, radar, and all these different types of things that make it very hard for us not to notice them. So perhaps that's what's going on here. Hard to say. Again, that's pure speculation. Just seems like there's no least likely place for a UFO which is trying to hide, other than an airport. I mean, you will be noticed. So, yeah, perhaps they're putting on displays. I do have another theory, which was actually given to me by a contactee, and she says that it's possible that these are actually practice events for a future worldwide landing. I hadn't even thought of that. But the fact that there are so many cases involving landings, yeah, that could be true. I guess time will tell. At any rate, I do think, as I said, that these cases do have something really important to tell us about the nature of the UFO phenomena and their agenda on planet Earth. And that's why I wanted to do this episode for you today. I hope you found these cases interesting. And until next time, keep looking for answers. Keep searching for the truth. And most important, keep having fun. Bye now.